Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm Milan, and I'm more than happy to be joined today by Naomi. Say something, Naomi. Does it work?
I was waiting to introduce me. Hi everyone. I'm Naomi Stanford, and I'm really happy to be joining this webinar. It's a story of Odile, the organization designer. If you haven't read the blog about it, don't worry, but there are 4 episodes in my blog on my website, www.naomistanford.com, which elaborate on the story that we're going to tell today. And the story that we're going to tell today is in several parts. And because it's a fairly long story, we're not going to spend a lot of time on each part, but as I said, you'll see further information on the blog. Milan is advancing the slides for me, so hopefully this is all going to work pretty nicely. And welcome and thanks to Milan for inviting me to do this for Intersection Group.
Yeah, so my job sounds easy. I will do that now. Just 2 words on the Intersection Group running this webinar series. We are a not-for-profit association dedicated to help people create better enterprises. We have a little asterisk there saying that by better we mean enterprises that pursue a clear purpose, are useful for people and their lives, and perform and deliver on their promises. If you are interested in this topic, please join us. We are running conferences, doing publications, running a community on Slack. I will talk a little bit about this after the real content here.
Okay, thanks, Milan. For those of you who don't know me, I've been in organization design for several decades now, and it's really interesting for me to be seeing how some of the aspects of it are changing, which we can touch on in the questions. But for the purposes of today, I'm going to tell the story of the Odile mapped to the organization design phases. So the first arrow is the enter and contract phase, which is the beginning here. And entering and contracting is a very standard part of consulting. So if any of you on the call today have not done a consulting course, I really recommend it if you want to do organization design work for reasons, again, which I can explain at the end. The second phase, as the action rises, you're starting to assess, and this is a second part of the design process. The third part is, as the action rises, is the design. And it's these 3, and particularly the design, where people get tremendously excited. And they think, right, we're going to move into a new design, blah, blah, blah. And then you sort of hit the climax of it all. Now, at that point, there's often a possibility that everything stops there because people then lose interest. But the next bit, the plan to transition, is very detailed project management. So you think about your design, you think about the work streams that you need to organize, the people, the technology, the supply chain, or whatever it is, and you do a detailed plan showing the interdependencies. And then you transition to it. And again, this is often a weak link. You don't actually transition. And in any project, there can be a disconnect between the design or the strategy for the design and how to operationalize it, deliver it, implement it. So the transition is really critical and is often neglected in a design process. And then the optimize phase, which is the final phase, when you're really tweaking the design to make sure it works, and then essentially starting again at the beginning because it's a continuous process, you then start to think, oh, again, this is not going to hold, we need to start again. So the whole thing should look more of a circle, but for the purposes of the story, we've presented in a linear way. So you'll see that as I talk, I'm going to go through the phases of the design, which are the top, and you'll see the storyline coming across through the bottom half. So if we move on, the exposition is a little bit about the background to the whole thing. It began March last year. And introducing Odile. Odile has got a background in social anthropology. And one of the interesting things about organization design is, how do you get into it? And I'm often being asked, how did I get into organization design? And my background actually is in education, and specifically adult education. And for a number of years, I worked in the adult education sector. In her case, she's got a background in social anthropology. And you will find that some of the big consultancies are now employing social anthropologists, because for organization design work, in the design work, they have a real skill in observing the way cultures and interactions are occurring in a social sense, but also how the formal elements, the bits that we can actually design, start to shape the culture and the social interactions, and vice versa. So we can design things like rules, we can design processes, we can design authority levels, etc. And then how the culture interacts with this and the social connections between people work within those frameworks becomes the realm of social anthropology within organization design. And as a recent example, and I don't know how many of you are noticing it, if you think about the rules and regulations of the COVID pandemic, we all had to wear masks, we couldn't travel, we had a whole new language around it. That has started to shape the way we interact with each other and our national and organizational cultures, and vice versa. So you can immediately start to see that organization design is about an interaction of cultures and social interactions and hard designable elements of the organization. And for this reason, I have quite a long definition of how I think about organization design, which I'm going to show you now, which is something about intentionally arranging how to align business elements. So it's more than one element. So if you're only interested in the technology, that is not enough to design the whole organization. You're really thinking about as many elements as have to interact as you can. And of course, you can cut the different business elements in different ways. And that becomes also an area to look at. How are you cutting the business elements? The second part of the definition is about doing the work necessary, which is often a long debate. Do we need to do this? And knowing your business purpose is essential. And I have been on lots of projects where people don't actually have a very clear view on the business purpose and the strategy to deliver it. And then there's something about giving high quality customer and employee experience, which you can argue with. And all of these parts of the definition that I use can be challenged, because some organizations are not very interested in, say, high quality employee experience, or they're not interested in particularly high quality customer experience. So thinking about what your organization means by organization design becomes important. The key thing to remember is, what is your intention, and do you know your purpose, and do you know your strategy? The other thing to remember about this definition is it involves interdependencies. So if we move on to the next slide, you can start to see that there are a number of things which are interdependent. And when you're designing, you're thinking about what are the businesses we're in. And in terms of intersection railways, you've got a number of different businesses within a railway organization. What are the outcomes we're expecting? What are the activities to deliver the outcomes within the different businesses? What types of people do we need? What skills do they have? What skills do we want them to have in the future? And what are the things that make the organization tick in terms of power, politics, business processes, technology platforms, and so forth? Now, even if you're looking at only one element of the business, and in our case, Odile is looking at the sleeper train strategy, you have to think about how that interacts with all the other parts of the organization, and then on into the business context, which we will come to in a moment. So that is the start of where I start to think about organization design as an interaction of various elements. And then I start to think about what are the steps in doing it, which I outlined very briefly, and I'm going to come back to now. And I think about it in these 6 phases. Now, be very aware, I do not think of it as a linear process. This is just to make it easy for us to look at them today. I think of it as a continuously evolving process, which is in fact iterative. So each phase is iterative, and you very rarely see a neat little movement from one phase to the next. What's important to note is that there are phases, and you do generally have to deliver every phase, regardless of the project, but not necessarily, as I say, in exactly this order. Some projects I've started with the design before I've ever done any assessment or essentially any entry and contracting. If you look to the middle of it, you'll see that there are things you have to do straight away. Start to think about how you're going to measure success of your outcomes and of the way you're delivering the piece of work. Think about the risks and think about your stakeholder engagement. In each of the phases, there are some typical actions, there are some typical deliverables, and there are some typical tools. And again, going back to the 4 blogs I wrote on this, there are tools mentioned there and links into the tools. And anything you're interested in, we can send on afterwards. So this is essentially the process that I follow, which for any of you who are project managers, you will be familiar with this because it's a very standard piece of project work to look at it like this. For people unfamiliar with organization design, just having this map tends to be very helpful. And for people who know that it turns into a messy, complicated thing, it's still helpful to realize that they are going to emerge at the end of it somehow or other. Moving on to the next bit of the rising action. Here, so now we've gone a little bit further into the dates. She's been there 2 weeks. She started to think about the work. She's looking now to meet with her manager, who's in the group HR director. And you'll see in the top right, it says enter and contract. So this is the organization design phase we're in. She's meeting with her boss. Now, typically, organization design, which is often linked with organization development, is seated within HR. And I've spent most of my working life challenging that location. I did once write a blog article, No HR, No Problem, which was published by a management consulting magazine, not by an HR magazine. And again, I won't go into why I think this, but I do tend to think that HR is not exactly right because organization design, you can see, is about strategy, it's about business purpose, it's about knowing the full business of the organization. Nevertheless, here she is in what's a standard role location. Now, what she's got is a group HR director who's pretty forward looking. And he wants her to think about the various disciplines involved in both change and design work. Now, I've spent most of my life in huge organizations, and I found that there are design and change people all over the place in various disciplines. And they all have different methodologies and different languages. And then if you bring in outside consultants, they have another different methodology and another different language. And it gets very messy, the field of organization change and design in a big organization. The second issue in most organizations is around the governance of an organization's design. There are often design authorities for defined projects. Now, that isn't the same as a governance model for the whole design of the whole organization. And I haven't come across an organization which does have continuous oversight of how the organization's design is changing, because the design of the organization is changing regardless of whether you're intentional about it or not. Every time you bring in a new person to your team or your business unit, or you merge two parts of your business unit, you're changing the design, and it may feel very local, but it will have repercussions. So this HR director wants her to do two things: develop essentially a movement in the organization around change and design work, collaborative working, and a governance method that isn't heavy-handed and too controlling. Now look at this, it's going to be evidence-based, real-time and data-driven. And this is where the organization design methodologies are going towards evidence-based, working on real-time, data-driven information. So that's the first stage in a project. Know what it is that you're actually doing and get a good brief for your work. The next step is starting to go in and make sort of introductions to yourself with others and get an idea of what's going on. And here we have Odile clarifying with the marketing director what the strategy is. Now, this has got another fairly typical thing. I've never heard a private sector organization say they didn't want to beat the competition. So what does that mean in practice? But here you've got an added complication of beat the competition, who are other railway operators, but also airlines, buses, and private transportation. Now, Odile now has to think, what on earth does that mean in terms of where do I have to look? How do I know we would be beating the competition? What do other people think? Does everybody have a similar view of who the competition is? Is it low-cost airlines? Is it Premier Airlines? And all of the answers to those types of questions have to feed into your design thinking, because they would be very different in their outcomes. And here you want top-notch customer experience. And I love it. I love the business jargon. You have no clue what somebody means by top-notch customer experience. You have to explore what that means. And top-notch customer experience for, as my daughter got on a train at the weekend with 2 young children crammed into a seat with 2 other people because the reservation system broke down, is not top-notch customer experience. And her experience is not going to be the same as someone traveling in a first-class seat. So start to think about what do we mean and who are the customers for these sorts of phrases that we use a lot without often exploring them. Also start to think about the interdependencies. So in this very small interaction with the marketing director, what are the interdependencies with intersection railways and the other railway operators, the buses, the private transportation, and so on, because there will be interdependencies. And the next thing is, so she's clarified the strategy, she's starting to build collaborative relationships. There are 2 other webinars available for you to participate in, of Severin, the service designer, and Ernestine, the enterprise architect. These are 2 examples of other designers in the organization. And one of the challenges Odile is facing is how to get these people who feel that they have a right to own design in some aspects, working with each other in a collaborative way. Because often, and this is a design flaw in most organizations, individuals like Ernestine or Severin are performance managed and rewarded on the delivery of their bit of whatever it is that they're designing. They're not rewarded necessarily, they might be, for collaborating with other people and thinking through and spending time working out how the various roles interact and how they can use each other's expertise to help each other do what they're supposed to be doing. There's very few performance management systems which incentivize collaborative behavior in a real way. So when you think about your own organization, if you're trying to do what Odile's trying to do here, build up collaborative working. It also takes quite a different character set, which is why social anthropology is quite helpful, of what qualities do you need as a consultant to forge collaborative relationships? How do you help people like Severin and Ernestine not be territorial? And if you've joined the Ernestine webinar earlier, I think it was last week, Ernestine has got a governance model for design, which Odile is challenging or about to challenge. I don't think Ernestine knows it quite at this point, but that is what is going to happen. So now you've got the sort of attention potentially building up. Moving on a little bit, you can start to see that if you want to think about the enterprise or the organization, you are trying to think about it holistically. And this is a very nice visual depiction of the sorts of questions you need to ask, not just in relation to the piece of work that you're doing, but also within its broader context. So you've got a number of levels of answers to the questions. So the identity of the area that you're looking at, the experience you want people to have, the architecture in all sorts of interpretations of that specific word that come into play. And this is a nice visual to try and explain to people the complexity that most organization design work is going into. Unfortunately, most organization design starts with people grabbing hold of the organization chart. And I just want to pause on that for a second. And at the same time, tell you never to look at the organization chart unless you want to find out what somebody's actual name is, if it's on the org chart. Don't look at it at the beginning because it's not going to tell you very much. What it might tell you, if you want to look at it, is that there are going to be designers in every one of those business units, potentially. They may have different names, but they will be designing. And there is a school of thought to say that everybody is a designer in an organization. But when you start to think about what does an organization chart tell us, it doesn't tell us very much. It tells us hierarchical relationships. It tells us how business units are named and what's in the business units in terms of activities. It doesn't show anything about how the business units interact, where their interdependencies are, how the actual individuals get to know each other, what their length of service is that might be of use. It doesn't tell you how they might be thought about by other people. And there's a whole range of things which don't get looked at in design terms if you only look at the chart. And anyone who's designing by moving people around or business units around an org chart is pretty much doomed to not getting the outcomes they're looking for. In my new book that came out last month, there is a whole handout, a graphic of what an organization chart is useful for and what it's not useful for, or what it doesn't show. So be very careful not to pay a huge amount of attention if you're doing design work to the organization chart. And there's a nice article from Strategy and Business called 10 Principles of Organization Design. And principle 3 is fix the chart last, not first. Moving on, a railway company and the Sleeper app, which is the one we're going to concentrate on, is operating in a hugely complex web of infrastructures, other companies, competing technologies or technologies which are not interoperable, and different regulations through various countries. Now, all of those have to play in at some level into your design thinking. Don't start design work by looking at a micro thing of, oh, we're designing a sleeper app. You're designing a sleeper app or doing any piece of design work, usually within a very complex environment. And looking at the environment is an essential part of this assess phase, which we're still in at this point. So when you're thinking about assessment, you're starting to think, what is the environment we're working in? And then you're starting to look more closely at the types of interdependencies that you're going to have to design linkages to and know the boundaries of. Okay, so you've done the assess phase, and now there's a question about, do I write this up and present it? And I was just having a discussion with Milan earlier this week on that. Here, Odile is thinking that she did a rigorous baseline assessment for herself. She knows the design landscape she's got to develop the collaborative movement in and get this nice continuous design governance framework into. But she's found a number of political difficulties. She's found that the environment is very complex. She's got to somehow present her findings in a way that is going to create a curiosity, that is going to create an interest, and is going to create involvement. Now, that is quite a hard call, because people are very defensive about what they've already got. So the moment you say something isn't working, they'll say, oh, yes, it is. And you get this sort of territorial behavior. So if she said in her report, we need to be more collaborative, somebody is going to say, but I own that space. So it's a really, really sensitive issue of how are you going to present information when you've done an assessment to show a landscape in a way that is going to evoke curiosity. And Milan was saying that is a report the best way. So that's a question mark for us to think about. Okay, so now she does something and we move into the next phase. So she writes up her report, and we'll see how she's done it. And we move into the climax. Now, the next stage is she has to think about how is she going to get this across to the organizational executive team in a way that they think, aha, yeah, she's talking sense here. Now, in her assess phase, she's come across the idea of this night train sleeper app project, which is a fairly small project in the scale of the whole intersection railway. Nevertheless, it's a complex piece of work. And if you've seen the other two webinars, it hasn't gone very well to date. So she's thinking she could rescue it, not in a kind of rescue way, but revive it and use it as a test bed. Now, this is a very good method for organization design work to have test beds and prototypes and experiments. I strongly advise against going for a business transformation, but I know I'm talking against the tide here. However, I don't think that works. So look for experiments, try things that you think will work. And so she's going to do that. So she presents to the executive team without really saying anything very much about what's not working. She begins with, let's use the night train sleeper app project as a way of testing out some designs. And she moves in and presents to them. And remember, she's fairly new to the organization. So if we move on to the next slide, you will see what they start to think about. So they're listening to her and they're kind of nodding approvingly. So she's obviously hit the right tone for her presentation by presenting the idea of, here's something we could test out. If we tested it like this, then we might find that. So that she's shown a systems map, which we'll get to in a minute. She's suggested that to get to the sleeper app really working, and the executive team know it's had a few hiccups, that they need better data. And she's presenting an idea of how to get better data. She's suggesting that the sleeper app hasn't been effective to date because the environment is very, very complex, and understanding that could be helpful. And she's suggesting another twist on stakeholders, that they tend to think about losses rather than gains. And if you can, which in my experience is exactly right, if you start to think about someone's thinking they're losing things, how can you start to balance the losses in their mind with the things they may gain? So going back to Ernestine, the enterprise architect, She might lose her idea for the governance board, but what would she gain from a different idea? And that's how you start to get a sort of acceptance of other ideas. So she's got through to this, and if you see the systems map, which I think is a very useful way of putting complexity across, and this is just the start of one, and thanks to Milan for doing this, it's really good, as I was explaining why they're very helpful. You start to build up pictures, visual pictures of the interdependencies, both within and outside the organization. And that becomes an area where you can start to think, do we need to design this bit? Do we need to design that bit? How can we be intentional about making these interdependencies work? And in most design work that I've been on, it's the interdependencies, the linkages, the boundary decisions that you make, which are really, really critical in design terms. So I'm going to move on quite swiftly because I'm keeping an eye on the time, but that systems map approach is very helpful. If you're not familiar with whole systems thinking, there's some very good courses available on it through places like Coursera or FutureLearn or the Open University in the UK. Moving on now into the falling action, which is going into the planning to transition stage. Now, this is December now from March. So if you start to think March to December, she's been doing the assessment, a high-level design, a thinking through the sleeper app as a place to experiment, a generating of interest and curiosity, some background work on a viable data set. She's done some ironing out of the language that people are using. So there's a fair bit of work between March and December before she starts going into a more detailed design. Now, the more detailed design is actually looking at things like the systems map, looking in much more detail at what the work streams might be to move into the experiment, what the activities might be. Now, this is a very difficult stage to enter fully, because at this stage, when people start to realize what it actually means, they start to dig their heels in. So here you've got Odile saying that the executive team supported the idea for using the Sleeper app, but it's a huge shift to move into this collaboration, to move into a design movement, to move into a continuous design governance approach, etc. And you've got the interpersonal dynamics coming into play. And they're picked up, I think, in blog 3 of this that I wrote. And the detailed design has to go into, in this particular example of Odile, where she's designing a collaborative movement using the Sleeper Train app as a test bed and a way of designing products and services for the whole of intersection railways in a way that is continuously governed. She's got to really think through what the design activities are. And as the marketing director is pointing out, there's a comms and engagement angle to plan in detail as well. And the comms and engagement often gets sidelined at this point because you think, oh, people have accepted the design, we don't need to keep on talking about it. But it's absolutely critical. So this planning to transition needs very, very good project management approaches and excellent navigation through the political complexities. It also requires a multidisciplinary team. And Odile has mustered this team from various parts of the organization, not just the designers, but legal people, financial people, people working in the governance arena, strategists, etc. And they are looking at what the proposal is for the Sleeper app from a collaborative point of view. And then in a separate slide, which we're not showing, they're looking at the proposal for the governance framework, which follows a similar type of process. And this is an actual slide of a piece of work that I did a couple of years ago. So don't look at it too closely. So you've got people in this slide asking questions, and you can see the types of questions that you should be paying attention to. Don't at this stage, when you're doing detailed design, feel defensive about the design. Kind of accept the discussion, and it can take an awful lot of time, which people get fantastically impatient about, in my experience. Take the time to have the discussion. Think about the context changes, particularly in that kind of environment where the regulations are changing all the time. Think about the unintended consequences. Think about the assumptions. And assumption testing is very, very useful. And think about the language that you're using. I've mentioned already top notch, but there are all sorts of words that people use without thinking about them. And particularly if you're working with multilingual people, they don't necessarily share the same understanding of the same word, or the word that you're using may not actually exist in their native language. And that has caused some interesting discussions in work that I've done. And then you've got the people who aren't really going along with it, who aren't going to say anything. How do you find that out? And one of the skills of a good consultant is listening attentively at what's being said, but also trying to notice what's not being said. And this is where often face-to-face is quite a lot more helpful than online or trying to do things through email. So this getting to the detailed design framework is really, really critical and takes time. So once you've got a plan and you start to move into it, you then have to deliver it. And we're going to skip quite a bit of that in this slide because it's going to take too long. So here in the next slide, she is discussing progress with the mentor. And this is now 3 months later, February now. 2022. And so she's had a year essentially to get this going. And in her work, she's done a tremendous amount in a year, working first in the first 3 months on what's going on. In the second 3 months, I can see how we could apply this into a segment of the organization. In the third 6 months, actually applying it into the Sleeper Train app. And you can learn more about the Sleeper Train app in the other 2 webinars. Now her mentor is saying that, have you ever thought that your work has now created this new role of strategy, design and delivery? And in the blogs on the topic, which is blog 4, you'll find that Odile is moving out of the HR function to report into this new role of strategy, design and delivery. And I think there's a very strong argument for organizations which are quite sizable to link design and delivery into strategy. And even if you want to stay in your own part of the organization, say as an enterprise architect, and which are typically in the IT role or the digital role, if you have a dotted line into design and delivery in its overarching way of design work, you're then starting to build that collaborative approach with a common language, a common data set, which Odile is what Odile has worked towards. And you can see what she's achieved, and the educating on complexity and the data set are both core parts of this. And the mentor is suggesting that she pats herself on the back, which again is something that is often not done enough, that you recognize your progress along the route. Because you think this is never getting anywhere, but if you stop and think as a team of designers, what have we achieved so far? That can be immensely helpful and very reassuring. Okay, moving on. This design process, you need a governance structure, and she established this for the Sleeper app that is continuous, that takes you through the exploration, the co-design, the realization. In this graphic, the word reuse is similar to optimize. You keep on trying it out, doing it again, and you've got the loop going on and on, that you're trying to govern that whole process, so that it's not a formal thing, but a networked, distributed, involving system, which is not project-based, which is keeping an eye on the continuing organization as a whole. You may additionally need project design boards or design authorities or whatever. And finally, into the optimize piece, how do you keep going? So now Odile is entering her second year. The taxonomy and data sets are useful. How do you keep them current? Think how many words have entered the organizational lexicon over the last year. They've got hybrid working, we've got all the stuff associated with COVID. We've now started to get, I'm sure, a whole lot of metaverse type vocabulary coming in. You need to keep things like the taxonomy. You need to keep the data sets current. Executive teams completely lose interest once they think something is done. So if the sleeper app is going well, how will she find the next piece of work to continue and build on and optimize her work? And so how is she going to do that? And those are ongoing questions. You can't drop things thinking I've completed something. So we're going to stop pretty much there. But what I hope you've taken away from this quite gallop through is three things. One, that organization design contexts are very complex, regardless of the scale that you're operating at. So recognize the complexity of the organization and its environment. Two, be collaborative and multidisciplinary. There are multiple people working in design. There is an argument to say that everybody is a designer. So if you think, for example, a lawyer is not a designer, the way they design legal frameworks is a design thing in an organization, or a legal ruling is a design aspect. And then the third thing is start small scale and test your ideas. So three things: recognize the complexity, be multidisciplinary and collaborative, and start small scale are the things that I really think Odile focused in on, and in this particular story was successful on. Not without a lot of hard work and upsides and downsides, but she got there to this point. And one could say her work is now beginning, which is actually probably the case. She's proven a small thing, now she has to carry on and do it bigger. And I think I'm going to hand over to Milan to explain some of the patterns that have come up in one of the books that the Intersection Group has written, and then close. You want to carry on, Milan?
Yes, thank you, Naomi. So just a few things that came up. So these are some of the patterns that I found in Odile's story, like dealing with corporate politics, listening to understand to different stakeholders, adjusting to the way the enterprise plans and does projects. So that's what we call the rhythms, building coalitions, getting executive buy-in, and making maps, for example, to depict shared understanding. And all of this is subject to the book Enterprise Design Patterns. And the overall thing that she went through, I think, is pretty much what Naomi wrote about in designing organizations. And if you're interested in more details about the story, here are the links. We will share the slides afterwards to the 4-part blog post with the same story on Naomi's blog. Just to tell you a little bit about like how to get involved in organization, business, design, architecture, enterprise design, architecture exchange that we are running. So we call all those people enterprise designers, which is maybe a term that is as good as any others, but it's the one that, when you Google it, you find our organization and our content. So we have enterprise designers from various backgrounds. We have a lot of enterprise and business architects, experienced service and business designers, and more organization designers, organization developers, but also other profiles on Slack. So please join us. This is what we are doing. We are working on a toolkit for this kind of work. We are running a yearly community, and we are working on digital tool support, such as a language and maps, like the Milky Way map and the Agile language, to model and map enterprises and make sense of them. And there are some publications, like the book Intersection that our group is named after, that I wrote in 2012, the pattern book, and also training products. This was one of a series of webinars. Naomi, you mentioned Ernestine last week. You can actually watch it as a replay. I'm going to present Severin the Service Designer, which is the more product service design oriented view. And next week, Wolfgang will talk about 3 changes to make your EA practice work better. I think we have 10 minutes for a little bit of Q&A. So I will, if I manage, start the Q&A mode.
So someone has asked about, while you're doing that, Milan, I'll pick up that question about
Yes.
after recovery when stakeholders get cold feet. How do you avoid that? That, I think, is a fascinating question. So in my working life, I've been an external consultant to organizations and an internal consultant. And if you're an internal consultant and fairly senior, you can keep on sort of working at it. If you're an external consultant, it's very, very much more difficult because organizations don't pay people to stay on and help optimize, to tweak the original design, to kind of keep on bringing the piece of work to the forefront of people's minds. It does work quite well if you, or can work quite well if you are internal and you've got a couple of people who you can keep with you as sponsors who are on the executive team. And that I have seen that work well, and it does keep things going. Inevitably, this context is going to change. So there's also an element of, do we have to rethink and change direction ourselves as a change project? Because change changes, as it were. And that's part of the going back to the beginning again. So I'm rather dubious about the phrase embed. I don't think you can embed change because change is change. You have to keep moving with it and shape it as much as you can to keep it within your strategic purpose. Because as the strategy might change, so your piece of work might change. And I think that is a really helpful question to start asking. At one level, you could ask, if it drops the change project, is that a poor reflection on you, or is it a reflection of the context has changed, which is why it's so critically important to keep an eye on the context. Because if you yourself, as the designer, can say the context is changing, or it is about to change, or I see signals of change, then we need to change our direction a bit, and we need to adapt and refocus the piece of work to take account of the new context changes. And that actually keeps people curious and interested. Plowing on with something which is potentially losing relevance is not the way to go, really. I hope that answers it. Any comments on that? Okay, so this
changes. It's a good one. So there's another question. Okay. Last time we learned to focus on business architecture over IT architecture to have more impact. I think that's referring to Wolfgang's webinar on Ernestine. Is fixing the org chart the tail end of business architecture? And if so, what comes before? Now, this is getting into the, I would say, subtle differences or big historic differences between business architecture and organization design, isn't it? I actually cannot tell you what comes first and what comes last between those two.
Yeah.
Yeah, Naomi, go ahead.
Well, the way I approach an organization chart, if you think what is it useful for and what doesn't it show? One way is to think of it as what we wanted to show who the people are who are working on a piece of work process and what activities they're doing and what is the weight of the work that they're doing. So what skills do they need? So you're sort of wrapping the people around the work and then structuring them into what then becomes the visual chart. If all you're interested in the organization chart is showing what the hierarchical authority levels are, who is managing who, not what they actually do, then it doesn't really matter. People think that who is managing who somehow or other relates to what they actually do in the day to day, but that isn't always the case, or isn't even often the case. Separate out what you want the organization chart, what information you think the organization chart is giving you that's useful, and then what do you want to fix about that bit. Then separate out the bits that the organization chart doesn't tell us, and do they need designing, and is it feasible to design them back into the chart, which would be the fixing it last bit. But in fact, the chart, because a chart is very, very shorthand and doesn't show a lot of the things, it's sort of a graphic which only has some uses. It's a tool for something, but not for everything. It's not a Swiss Army knife that will do anything. It's a one screwdriver kind of thing.
Yeah, I would add that there are not many Swiss Army knives I've come across in this work, but one thing that always creates confusion is the relationship between an org chart that, as you said, shows the like who manages whom, a capability map that shows what's going, like what needs to be done, but it's usually driven rather from the assets, not so much from the people. And things like, for example, employee experience journeys, or like self-organization models, like in Agile or in Lean, and all of those together then are actually more informative usually about what's actually going on compared to the org chart.
That's right, and there are nice software packages now available, like organizational network mapping packages, which will map networks which show you what's going on, and then theoretically you could superimpose an org chart on them, but you'll see that the network mapping is of people's communications with each other bears very, very little resemblance to the org chart. Okay.
One more question. Friedhof is asking, could you go deeper into how behavior change can be achieved through org design? How to create doubt, I like that, in existing ways of working.
That's a great question. Well, I think most people have doubt in existing ways of working anyway, particularly if you're at the lower level of the organization. But behavior change can be achieved through organization design by looking at the systems and processes and rules and policies that shape it. And we've seen that quite extensively in COVID. So you've got an example where the design of the organization essentially has been changed slightly unintentionally by people moving online, but we're now trying to make that intentional for office workers. So we're now getting a whole mass of questions about how do you design hybrid working. And that spills over into what is the physical design of office buildings, etc. And now you can start to see how that relates to behavior change, because people are starting to think, do I really want to sit in a hot desk? Now that is a behavior change brought about by a design change when they haven't had to go into the office, they've been working from home or from wherever. And the design of the physical layout has to now correspond to their mental thinking about what behaviors are appropriate now they go back into the office. So you can see an immediate impact on physical design. You can see on physical design other design impacts straight away, like a lot of buildings are now installing sort of contactless lift operating things. So you don't press a button with your finger, you wave your hand or whatever, or your phone or your card. And if you think about driver behavior, in different countries, the way that the road regulations, the road pattern layouts, all of which are designable, influence driver behavior. You can see driving in Lagos is completely different from driving in London. The driver behavior patterns are different. And supposing you wanted to create, if you were in Lagos and you say, right, where the road traffic accidents are far too many, you're beginning to create doubt in that existing method of driving. And you might then be able to insert more rules or more traffic signs or whatever to change driver behavior. But there is both incentives and penalties around that. And the creating doubt always exists, and particularly at the lower levels and through customers. Customers say, why are we doing it this way? Or why do they do that? And at lower level employees who are in hierarchical terms, not value terms, who are in the day-to-day, will tell you endless ways they're doubtful about the existing ways of working. That needs raising up into the sort of strategic level. I could go on about this, but I see it's 4 o'clock. So yes. I don't know if that begins to answer that question, but that's how you can start to shape it. Think about how your own behaviors have changed as a result of COVID, specifically designable things, regulations, requirements to vaccinate or not, etc.
All right, yeah, I think we will wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Naomi, for doing this. And
You're
thank
welcome.
you everyone for joining. And yeah, if you're interested in continuing the conversation, join us on Slack. There's the URL on screen. Yeah, tune in next time. And have a great week.
There are quite a few questions, I think, that haven't been answered. There's one on coaching. So let's pick those up, Milan, and we can answer them other methods.
Yeah, let's do that.
If you can send them to me, that would be great.
I will.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, thanks very much, everybody. Thank you. And thanks, Milan, again.
Bye.